to be with you. God is good to bring me to New Zealand. It's been on my list for a long time, but I'm thankful that Mary wanted to talk to my wife because I do get to come along for the ride. I will apologize now for speaking Texan. I will probably say restroom instead of toilet and trash instead of rubbish, but bear with me. Please forgive me. It's no intention to offend, but please forgive me. No, we are glad to be here. We have a number of connections with you guys all across the world. Charles and Kara Spear were our teachers at Sunset. You've had students through the Bible school here from Chile, and so it's good to be here and actually see the work that you are doing and the kingdom that you are blessing because of your faithfulness to our God. I praise you for that. This morning, David has asked me to speak about a topic that is really very dear to my heart because it talks about rest. It talks about Sabbath. It talks about us getting into a rhythm that God is in. And constantly throughout my life, as you could hear from the wonderful introduction, I've done a lot of different things in life. And God has blessed me with the ability to do a lot of different things, but I'm a jack of all trades, not real deep in any, but a very superficial in a lot. But one of the things that really truly drives me is that we can try to find rest in our God. So this morning, we're going to touch this topic, and I promise you, great job on the scripture reading. We will get to Hebrews later on. Sounds like an odd place to talk about the rest, but we will get there. But this morning, we live our lives, and my wife and I especially have lived our lives into where we go to these wonderful places to do ministry. And we've lived in Nicaragua, or she's lived in Nicaragua and Costa Rica. I've lived in Colombia and Santiago, Chile, and we've lived in all these wonderful places and with their great, exciting adventures. And we go and we dive into those and we throw ourselves into those ministries and we enjoy those times and we begin to minister to people. And in those ministries to people, we find sorrow and heartache. We find challenges. We find difficulties. But we fall in love with these people. We fall in love with ministering to them, and they fall in love with us, and we grow through those processes, and we usually come out on the other side in a better place. And then it seems like every time you kind of come out on the other side, you kind of start all over and begin again. You ever felt that way? That's just this continual cycle in life that it's great, we go through the difficulties, and we come out and we start over. But that's life, is it not? That's life in the way we live. And one of the things I want to challenge us with this morning is, can we find a better way or a better principle to live our lives on that helps us through that cycle, that maybe we don't just constantly continue on that cycle? Briefly want to tell you about my life. In 2011, doing mission work in Santiago, Chile, the work was doing wonderful. We were baptizing people, we were ministering to people, we were discipling people, and we were having studies, and the church seemed to be in a really good place. But I remember one night going to a Bible study, I began to ask God in prayer. We always prayed for our Bible studies because we wanted them to go well. But this night I prayed, Lord, cancel this study for me. Make something happen that I won't have to go to this Bible study. And what kind of situation is a preacher in or a minister in if he's calling God to cancel what he's about to do in Bible study? And he answered my prayer. And then I spent the next couple hours driving around trying to figure out what was going on in my life. Got home that night. My lovely wife was still up. Kids were all in bed. And she greeted me. And I greeted her with kind of a cold greeting. And I said, you better be glad that they don't offer me a job sweeping the streets of Santiago, because if they do, I'm gone. And she was taken back, and she looked at me and says, But what about me and the kids? I said, I don't care. I'm done. I'm done with all of this. I'm done with this spiritual life. I'm done with what's going on. I'm checked out. I was burnt out. I was tired. I was exhausted. I was ready to give up. And the only solution I had at that point, if I was going to survive that, was to actually take a sabbatical. Because it was what God needed. What I found during that time of sabbatical, if you want to know more about that, this is why it's such a passage. If you want to know where I'd be happy to visit with you. But this time of sabbatical taught me that my life and my ministry was built upon the foundation of some guiding principles that were very wrong. They were very erred. They did not really fit with what God wanted me to do in my life. And so one of the challenges in that process is I found that my life commandments, those things that drive me, and I'll explain that in a minute, those things that drove me to hurt, drove me to pain, drove me to burnout, drove me to misery, drove me to broken relationships because I did not understand who God was and what God needed me to do in my life. And so we see that in our lives there are these things called life commandments. There are commandments that we have in our lives that determine what we do and where we go. Have you ever used a GPS? Y'all know what GPS is, right? You punch in the address and it tells you how to get from point A to point B. Well, underlying directives in GPS determine fastest way to get there, whether there's going to be a toll road, whether you want to have the most stops, the most direct way. And in those processes, those directives guide that process to get you from point A to point B. Have you ever followed a GPS and it take you to the wrong place? If it takes you to the wrong place, what's the problem? You do what? Okay? You would think the thing doesn't work, but in reality, the problem is you put the address in wrong, or you didn't have the right directives to get you where you needed to be. Okay? Well, our lives work the same way. When we believe certain things about ourselves, we develop these life commandments about ourselves, and they guide every step of our walk, every step of our process. Even so much so that we can believe in our mind certain things that will take us down paths that are not good. For example, a young kamikaze pilot gets in his airplane in World War II with not enough fuel to return, and he chooses to drive his airplane into a battleship. Does that make any sense to any of us? But he had believed his directives that led him to the point where he would sacrifice that for his family because of honor. You look at, let's go back, and I had a whole list of them. I'm going to do two of them. You look at the guys who got on the airplanes and drove the airplanes into the Twin Towers in 2011. Their directives, their life commandments told them that it was better to die in that process than to live a life that didn't honor their God. How often do our directives and our guidelines or our life commandments do that to us? Some more simple ones so we don't stay on that such a dark note there. How many of you take your shoes off at home when you get home? Great. Why? How many of you, when you come into a room, you choose to greet everyone in the room? Well, I grew up that way. How many of you, when you come to church, you come dressed and you sit and you participate and then you don't do anything else? It's what you were taught. How many of us show respect for our elderly or the golden age? Okay? Why? Because we were taught and we were given these directives in our lives that guide every process of what we are about doing in this life. And they come through our experiences as kids. They come through our experiences in our society. They come to us by the things we feel and we're taught by those around us. But also they come by verbal command. I don't know about you guys, but in the U.S., we tell our boys all the time, boys don't cry, girls can. Is that true here? Boys are to be tough, girls, it's okay to cry. Well, we raise a bunch of boys who won't be in touch with their emotional side. And sometimes we have people say things to us or teach us things that we twist and turn and make them a directive in our mind. So what I found in the first 10 years of my 10 years of my ministry, was that my ministry was built on foundational directives that didn't lead me to a closer relationship with God. They led me to burnout, emptiness, depression, broken relationships. And so as I looked at my life through God's rest, I learned a few things about God that established better directives in my life to keep me from that path. And I believe these three things that we'll look at this morning, if we can bring them into our lives and we can make them a part of who we are and part of our day-to-day life, they will create in us a ministry or an outreach or a life of service that is in godly rhythm. But it's not only beneficial for me, but it'll also glorify God in my life and in our churches and in our ministries. So now we come to the text that I was given this morning. Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. The heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he was doing, and he rested on the seventh day for all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from his work and his labor and creation. If we're truly to think about this passage of Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, when God is talking about God's creation and God resting in his creation and what that looks like, we have to really go in and we have to see, who is God talking to at this point? At what point are we finding ourselves in this trajectory with God's people that they would need now to know that he rested on the seventh day? And this is where the three principles will come. He's talking to the Israelites at the time when God brought them out of Egypt. I don't know if you know, but Genesis is written when Mount Sinai is present. It's after the fact. It's after what is going on. And so God is now going to call them back. He's brought them as a people, and he's brought them all as a people and says, I'm going to be your God, and you're going to be my people. And then he begins to tell them the story of Genesis through Moses. So when we read Moses, or when we read Genesis, we have to read Genesis in light of freedom from slavery, and freedom from a pagan world, and freedom from where they found themselves, and God has brought them out into a place where God is now telling them who you are and what you're about and where you come from. Which brings us to our first point. If you've got your Bibles, you can turn to Exodus chapter 19, and this is where we find ourselves. This is where we find ourselves in this process. In verses 2 through 6, it says, there Israel encamped before the mountain. While Moses went up to God, the Lord called to him out of the mountain. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I have done to the Egyptians, and now how far I have borne you on eagle's wings and brought you out myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my commandments, you shall be my treasured possession among the people from all the earth, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom, a priest and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. Now those are almost the same time, exactly the same time, where we started in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 18 and following. He's brought them in. He's brought them out of the land of Egypt. And so we see that He's about to set them on motion to be a people who can glorify His name, who can be His people, and He wants to set in their lives some life commandments, some directives in their lives that will help them live the life He's calling them to live, and help them, guide them through the process, and help them glorify Him in that process. And the first one, the first life commandment that we look at when we see that God has rested, and He's telling them about rest after they come out of Egypt, is that your identity, their identity as a people, our identity as Christians, our identity rests on who we are, not what we do. Our identity is resting on who we are, not what we do. You think about it. These are Israelites coming out of the slavery for so many generations. What happened to a slave when he could no longer build bricks? What happened to a slave's family when he could no longer work for them? What happened when he could no longer produce? They were discarded because in Egypt, and often we in our society believe that our identity comes from what we do. Okay? God has just brought them out of Egypt. He's brought them out of a land, and He says in the story about telling them who God is, it says that God rested on the seventh day. God has created in them a value because of who they are, not what they've done. They've just lived for 400 years or 4 generations in Egypt, feeling the pressure of being who they should be to produce. So God says by resting, or God says by the story of His creation, He says, you are people defined by who I made you to be, not what you can do. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. It says, let us make men in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, or the heavens, and over the livestock of the earth, and over every creeping creature that creeps on the earth. The Israelites were valuable to God for who He made them to be, not what they could do. They were valuable to God because they were a part of His wonderful creation. They were valuable to God because they were made in the image of God. They were valuable to God because He gave them dominion. They were valuable to God because He gave them a place to be in a relationship. And they were valuable to God because He was in relationship with them. So the first directive in our lives, if we want to understand why God rests, is to show us that our identity is in Him, not what we're capable of doing. The second thing we see, that the second process of God rest in the Sabbath rest in Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, comes when the day 7 is done. He says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Did God have to rest because He was tired? No. We rest because we're tired. We work and we physically labor and we go through certain points, and at the end of the day we're rested and we get tired. God did not have to rest. He chose to rest. And what is He telling them by saying, I'm choosing to create no more and rest? He says, you are enough the way I created you. You are enough because God says you're enough. I read a story this past week about Michelangelo and his carving this David statue. And this guy was looking at this story, or was telling this story that he had researched about Michelangelo. And I don't know if you know, but the block of marble that he used was discarded 40 years earlier by sculptors as a bad piece of marble. They couldn't use it. But when Michelangelo sees this block of marble, he sees David in the marble. And he begins to chisel. and he begins to hit it, and he begins to strike it, and he begins to mold it, and he begins to make it where it needs to be and what it needs to be, and it begins to come out. What happens if you hit it one time too many? What happens if he decided at one point that it needed just a little bit more taking off and he took the whole thing down? Who decided that the marble and the statue of David was perfect the way it was? Michelangelo. Now, when he finished the statue of David, was it flawless? Absolutely not. But it was a masterpiece. Was it lacking? Probably. But it was enough. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. But it was complete. So when we look at ourselves, when God says, okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to rest from creation, what is He saying about His creation? It's enough. It's enough. It's going to be okay. It's perfect in my eyes. It can glorify me. It can do what it needs to be. So He chooses to stop and to rest because saying, you're good enough. I don't have to keep creating on you. I don't have to keep hitting at you because what I see and where I'm at is that we, His creation, are good enough. So I don't have to strive like the pagans, and I don't have to strive like the Gentiles, and I don't have to strive like the world because I'm good enough. Not because of me, but because of the sculptor. The sculptor. So if we can live in our lives, if we can establish in our lives the principle that we are enough for God, it changes the way we do Christianity. It changes the way we do life. And the third one, we're almost done. And the third point we see is we see that it's interesting to me that when you look at the story of creation, there's a creation A and a creation B. You have creation A in Genesis chapter 1, then you have the creation B story of the details of mankind, how we were made. Because in Genesis 1, just said Genesis 2, it talks about that. And smack dab in the middle, He says, it's time to rest. So how important is the rest if He's going to sandwich it between the two creation stories? And we know that what God is showing and what I've learned in my process is that there is a process that in the middle of creation, the middle of the two creation stories, we see that God has said it's enough, therefore He can rest. And if we see creation, we see what we're about, we see what we can take the time to trust that God is still at work in creation. We know that God created the creation to continually create. We know that God created the trees to bear more fruit and have more trees. We know that God created the animals to bear, to multiply and continue to grow. We know that He did that with us, and we know that He's still integral in that process, because you can see it in Psalm 139. He says, from the inward parts you knitted me together in my mother's womb. God has not stopped creating. God has not stopped the process of creation. God has said, by saying you can stop. Think about it. He's telling a people who've lived their lives to produce. He says you can stop and you can trust me to do the rest of the work. You don't have to work 24/7 to make it happen because you can trust me to do that work. Have you ever thought about why God starts the stories? And it's interesting, He starts the stories on the first, there was night and then there was day. You know, verse 7, or day 7 is the only one that doesn't have a night and a day. Why? Because His work never stops. His work that He created never stopped, but He never stops. So we can trust Him through that. But He also says that unlike what we believe about ourselves, is our day starts when we get up in the morning and go to work. God says, no, your day should probably start trusting me to do the work while you sleep, and then you get up and work. How would that change our Christian walk? How would that change our Christian life if we had the directive that I first enjoyed God's rest and my rest, then I go to work, instead of having to get up to go to work and rest when I'm tired? What does God call us to do? He says rest. He is a resting being. He stops from his work. But what he says in these three things that I've told you is, if you can develop the life commandments that say your identity is who God created you to be, your completeness is determined by God, and your trust is based on His performance, not your performance, God will do great things in your life. It's a hard lesson for me to learn. I'm still learning it. But here's what he says in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 18. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire, darkness of gloom and tempest, and the sound of trumpets, and the voice of the word that makes the hearer beg that no further message be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given. Even if a beast touches the mountain, it was to be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses trembled in fear. You have not come to that. In Hebrews he says, but you have come to the mountain Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the innumerable angels in feast gather, to an assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all the spirits, and the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkling of blood that speaks better word than the blood of Abel. We're not at the mountain of Sinai, where we have to be afraid of who our God is. We are at Mount Zion, where we are chosen, we are identified, and we are complete, and we can trust Him with all our hearts. I believe that if we look at Genesis chapter 2, it's really about spiritual life. And I see that when I read Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. When God is helping Peter or Paul tell the brethren how to write their life commandments. And he says, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not of your own doing. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that one may boast. For we are workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which are prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. 3 life principles. Trust God, not in your own ability. It's for by grace you have been saved. You're enough because God makes you enough. And this is not of your own doing, but is a gift of God. And identity is who you are, not what you're to do. We are the workmanship of God, created by God to works He's put before us. If we can learn that about God's rest, if we can learn that from a being who chose to rest and didn't need to rest, to show us our identity, that we're enough, and we can trust Him through that, I promise you that your ministry, your service, your engagement with the community, you can do that with a whole heart, knowing that our value doesn't come from what we do, but from who we are, chosen people. The second thing, we can celebrate our salvation. We can come together and celebrate our salvation, enjoy what God has given us, with the understanding that we are not enough, but we are made enough by Christ. And finally, if we can get that life commandment in our lives, we can learn to trust God in good times and in bad times, because we know that God does not judge us based on our performance, but based on His performance. So may God bless you as you search to rest like God rests in your identity, in your being complete, and in who you can be for the Lord. May God bless you.